Somewhere over Russia's Voronezh region on November 18, 2025, four thin white lines carved themselves across the afternoon sky. People on the ground pulled out their phones, assuming they were just filming another air defense incident for social media.
We are now learning that Ukraine has successfully hit an ammunition depot deep inside Russia using 8 long-range U.S. missiles.
The military is calling overnight drone strikes on Russia one of the biggest attacks of its kind.
Then, the missiles broke apart, blossoming into dozens of smaller streaks that fanned out over the horizon. In a few seconds, a routine war backdrop turned into something very different. Moscow rushed to say that Ukraine had tried to hit civilians. Kyiv said something else entirely. This was a precision strike with U.S.-made ATACMS missiles against military targets deep inside Russia. On paper, that sounds like just one more escalation in a long war. In reality, that single statement quietly crossed a line the Kremlin thought would hold forever. For the first time, Ukraine's general staff openly confirmed
Слава Україні! Розпочалась 350...
using American ATACMS on Russia's internationally recognized territory, calling it a significant development and promising more such strikes to come. Until now, those missiles were supposed to be limited to occupied Ukrainian land, Crimea, the Donbass, Russian bases on stolen soil. That era is over. The war is no longer something Russia can comfortably export across the border while assuming its own rear will never pay the price. First, we need to understand what has actually been unleashed. ATACMS, short for Army Tactical Missile System, is a US-made ballistic missile fired from launchers like HIMARS and MLRS. It does not cruise low and slow like a drone or a cruise missile. It arcs high into the sky, then dives down at high speed, making it much harder to intercept. Depending on the variant, it can hit targets up to around 300 kilometers away. For almost 2 years of this war, that range was politically handcuffed. The United States shipped ATACMS to Ukraine, but with a strict condition. They were only to be used against targets in occupied Ukraine, not inside Russia itself. Later, in November 2024, President Joe Biden lifted those geographic limits, recognizing that many of the systems used to bomb Ukrainian cities sit safely across the border on Russian soil. That decision was heavily criticized by Donald Trump. And when Trump returned to office, the Pentagon reportedly introduced a quiet review process that effectively froze long-range strikes inside Russia for months. Ukraine had the missiles, it had the range, it simply did not have the green light. That is what makes November 18th so important. According to Ukraine's general staff, ATACMS were used that day to strike military targets in Russia. According to Defense Blog and other open-source analysts, those targets were in the Voronezh region, roughly 250 kilometers from the border, with 4 missiles launched from Ukrainian territory. The likely objective? The Baltimor airbase near Voronezh city, and possibly the nearby Pogonovo training ground. Baltimore is not just some airstrip in the middle of nowhere, hosts a regiment of Russian strike aircraft, Su-34 fighter bombers, that have been used repeatedly to drop glide bombs and missiles on Ukrainian cities and frontline positions. Pogonovo, meanwhile, is used to assemble and train Russian units before they are shipped off to fight. From a Ukrainian and US perspective, these are textbook military targets. This is the stage on which the rest of the story now unfolds. The Russian Defense Ministry, of course, told a very different story. In statements amplified by state media and picked up by international outlets, Moscow claimed that 4 US-made ATACMS were fired at the city of Voronezh itself, allegedly aiming at civilian facilities. Russian officials said their S-400 and Pantsir air defense systems shot down all 4 missiles, and that falling debris caused minor damage to a retirement home, an orphanage, and a private house, no casualties reported. On paper, it sounds neat and reassuring. Perfect interception, no real damage, nothing to worry about. But the images and videos tell another story. Local residents filmed those 4 bright trails and then filmed mid-air bursts, exactly what you expect when a cluster warhead ATACMS opens up and releases its submunitions, not when it is destroyed by an interceptor. Photos of debris show mainly the empty rocket motor casings, with the front sections gone and little fragmentation damage. Again, That matches a missile that has already deployed its payload, not one torn apart mid-flight by air defense. There is no independent evidence of destroyed civilian buildings, no crater photos from hit orphanages, no local reports of mass casualties. Russia itself admits there were no deaths, so we are left with two competing narratives. Ukraine says it struck military targets with precision weapons provided by its allies. Russia says Ukraine tried to hit civilians and that heroic air defenses stopped every missile. Open-source evidence leans heavily toward Ukraine's version. This looks like a classic ATACMS cluster strike on a military area, airbase, training ground, or both, with Russia doing what it always does, claiming that civilian areas were under attack to muddy the legal and political waters, while quietly dealing with the damage on its own military infrastructure behind the scenes. If you line up the pieces, the logic becomes obvious. Russia uses bases like Baltimore to launch strike aircraft that bomb Ukraine. Those aircraft take off from runways they assume are untouchable. The air defense systems that protect those bases, S-400, Pantsir, and others, have already been degraded by Ukrainian drones and special forces in other regions. ATACMS arrives as the next layer in that campaign. Bypass the front line, hit the source of the problem, and force Russia to defend its own backyard instead of attacking someone else's. From the U.S. perspective, this is exactly how American weapons are supposed to be used, to reduce Russia's ability to wage aggressive war, not to terrorize civilians. But the military story is only half of the tension here. The other half is political. So when Ukraine publicly confirms ATACMS strikes on Russian territory, and Russia publicly complains about US-made missiles over Voronezh, that tells us something has shifted. Either the Trump administration has quietly relaxed the restrictions, or Kyiv is pushing the envelope with at least tacit acceptance from key American officials. In practical terms, this strike sends two very clear messages. To Kyiv, it says, "You are not alone. The tools we gave you are not just for holding the line. They can be used to make Russia feel the cost of its aggression on its own territory." To Moscow, it says, "There is no sanctuary. The airfields, training grounds, and missile sites you use to attack Ukraine are all fair game, whether they sit in occupied Luhansk or in Voronezh proper." That is why this matters so much more than a single set of explosions on a single day. Once ATACMS is back in the game over Russia, this becomes a campaign, not a one-off. Airbases like Baltimore and others suddenly have to disperse aircraft, dig hardened shelters, move fuel and ammunition farther back, and keep air defense systems on permanent high alert. Every plane they move and every bunker they build is money and time not spent on offense against Ukraine. When people in Voronezh look up and see US-made missiles breaking apart over their own region, that illusion cracks. Even if the physical damage is limited, the message is not. This is no longer a distant campaign. It is something that can reach them directly. So what happens next? There are three broad paths that grow out of this moment, and each one reshapes the war in a different way. The first is normalization. In this scenario, ATACMS strikes become a semi-regular feature of the war. Ukraine hits air bases, air defense sites, and command centers inside Russia when they are clearly linked to attacks on Ukrainian territory. The United States quietly continues to approve these missions under strict conditions. Military targets only, no symbolic strikes on purely civilian infrastructure, and no attempts to decapitate the Russian leadership. Russia complains loudly, retaliates with more of the same against Ukraine, but ultimately accepts that deep strikes on its own military infrastructure are now part of the battlefield. The second path is coercive pressure. Over time, repeated deep strikes on Russian bases begin to bite. Generals see their aircraft destroyed on the ground. Local officials panic over the possibility of more hits. Elites realize that their assumption of physical safety inside Russia is gone. That does not automatically produce peace, but it raises the cost of continuing the war and strengthens the argument inside Moscow that further escalation only invites more pain for Russia itself. The more Russia is forced to defend its own territory, the harder it becomes to sustain an offensive war abroad. The third path is the red line narrative the Kremlin will push hardest. Russia will frame every ATACMS strike as an American attack on Russia itself, not just a Ukrainian operation with Western support. It will threaten military technical responses, talk about nuclear options, and try to scare Western audiences into backing off. The goal is simple: split U.S. politics, fracture NATO unity, and convince ordinary Americans that supporting Ukraine is too dangerous to continue. But here is the uncomfortable truth for the Kremlin. It has played this card before. Every major upgrade in Western support, HIMARS, Patriot systems, Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, F-16s, and now ATACMS into Russia, has been labeled a red line. And yet, when those lines were crossed, Moscow did not risk open war with NATO. It escalated against the same target it always does: Ukraine. The pattern suggests that the real question for Washington and Kyiv is not whether Russia will shout escalation. It is whether holding back has actually made Ukrainians safer, or simply given the Kremlin more time to adapt and entrench. Strikes on Voronezh is not reckless. It is overdue. Russia has spent years bombing Ukraine's cities, power plants, rail networks, and ports from the safety of bases it assumed would never be touched. Now, for the first time in months, those bases are being reminded that war has consequences on both sides of the border. That changes the risk calculation in Moscow, in Kyiv, and in every Western capital deciding what to send next. Because after Voronezh, one thing is clear. Once US-made missiles start landing on Russian air bases, the map of this conflict changes. And for Vladimir Putin, the idea of a safe Russia just got a lot smaller.